This is Super Bubble Bobble MD on the Sega Mega Drive. The game was a perfectly normal, regular crossover between Bubble Bobble, Shin Chan and Doraemon. Or was it? Well guys, there's a lot to unpack here, so let's just start from somewhere that's going to make sense of all this. Alright guys, so this is going to be a long one. In this video, we're going to take a look at Super Bubble Bobble MD and compare its design to some of the mainline games in the series, in order to see just what these bootleg developers managed to achieve. Bubble Bobble, the arcade game designed originally for couples that became so popular in the 80s, was ported to just about every 8-bit home console and computer that could handle a version of it. From the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64 to the Sega Master System and NES, even handhelds such as the Game Gear and the Game Boy had their own Bubble Bobble versions. You'd be hard-pressed to find someone who grew up in the 80s or 90s that hasn't played or at least heard of Bubble Bobble. Despite being designed with two players in mind, originally aimed at couples even, the game is actually just as much fun and addictive in its single-player mode, which gave it an even wider reach. Bubble Bobble would see many variants and would spawn many sequels and spin-offs, including the Rainbow Islands games, Parasol Stars, Puzzle Bubble, as well as be an inspiration to many single-screen arcade games such as the classic Snow Bros, which you guys know I love a lot. The NES and Famicom would see a wonderful sequel to Bubble Bobble in the form of Bubble Bobble Part 2, which was very popular here in Macedonia, and I still have bootleg Famicom cartridges of it. And it also got a Game Boy version, much like the first game. We'd also get odd bootlegs or failed attempts at rip-offs well into the 2000s, and a good example from the early rip-offs is the Vatara Supervision game. Now, during the 16-bit home console and computer generation, Parasol Stars did make it to the PC Engine TurboGrafx in what I personally believe is its absolute best version, at least in my opinion. It also had a wonderful Amiga port where, interestingly enough, the original Bubble Bobble was also ported. Now, at the arcades, unless we count the Rainbow Island games, Bubble Bobble wouldn't receive a proper, real direct sequel until 1994, when they released Bubble Symphony. Bubble Bobble Symphony wouldn't come out on consoles until 1997, and then it released as a Japan-exclusive Saturn game, which is actually a very good port of the game. It's a phenomenal port. Now guys, remember Bubble Symphony, as it's going to be a very important game for this video, and we'll be coming back to it several times throughout the review. So, with all these different Bubble Bobble versions, sequels, ports, spin-offs, and whatnot, the thought that a version for the Sega Mega Drive didn't exist back then never even crossed our minds as kids. After all, the game was just about everywhere, whether you liked it or not. Little did I know that the Bubble Bobble game I saw at a kid's house once, for the Mega Drive mind you, or Genesis as you all like to call it, and the Bubble Bobble game that I kept ignoring over at the rental store wasn't an official game. To us, it was just another Bubble Bobble version, and it ended there. I didn't give it much thought. It would take decades for me to realize that the Bubble Bobble game on Mega Drive I saw when I was a kid was actually something special. That it wasn't your average official Bubble Bobble sequel, but rather a very obscure and, especially in the first world, not very well known bootleg title that just so happened to be sold here in the developing world. So guys, just how good is this game? Is it playable? Is it a royal mess? Or like some of these bootleg games that I review on my channel, a hidden gem? Well, we're gonna take a look at it, and we're gonna take this one step at a time because there's a lot to say about this one. So the premise is pretty much the same as in any other Bubble Bobble game. The player spits out bubbles which they use to entrap enemies in. Then the player pops the bubbles by touching them in order to defeat the enemies. Defeat all enemies in a level and you move on to the next one, until you eventually hit a boss battle. The game released in 1995 or so and was probably developed by GameTech, and I believe this is true because they reuse some assets from The Lion King 2. Now, on the surface, Super Bubble Bobble MD seems like a very competent Bubble Bobble game. It even has two-player co-op mode, which was omitted from the Master System version of the game, from the NES sequel Bubble Bobble Part 2, and from the Game Boy games. The game runs smoothly even when a ton of sprites are present on screen. Now, if only the game played anything like the official Bubble Bobble games, Mega Drive owners would have been in for a treat. Unfortunately, things are not so good. The Bubble Bobble games, while simple on the surface, have a lot of depth to them. The first game alone has entire systems and mechanics that determine when and what type of power-ups and items drop or appear, whether the game increases in difficulty or not. It has a very interesting dynamic difficulty system, when bonus levels are triggered and appear, and so on. The arcade Bubble Bobble games, as well as their best home ports, are very highly polished games, guys. And these games treat the player with utmost respect. What I mean by this is that, for example, hitboxes are very carefully tailored to the sprites, making tight encounters between enemies and the player, between the player and enemy projectiles possible, and that helps a lot when it comes to dodging enemies, when it comes to dodging enemy attacks, and so forth. There are even times when the player is invincible, for example, if they are in a wall while shooting out a bubble at an enemy, and so on. There are many aspects of the games that work for the player and not against them. The games also slowly, gradually ramp up in difficulty, allowing less experienced players to enjoy a good portion of the game before things become hairy and very difficult, because these games do get genuinely hard later on. And this right here is what makes video games accessible. This is what I would consider good video game accessibility. It allows both hardcore and casual players to enjoy the games. Now, if you expect Super Bubble Bobble MD to be anything like this, you will experience what I can only describe as a bubble culture shock. No, this one is very hard, right from the get-go, and for all the wrong reasons too, and let me tell you why. One of the biggest and most glaring problems with Super Bubble Bobble MD that makes it so difficult and uncomfortable to play at times are the enormous, huge hitboxes that all sprites have. Everything from the player and their bubbles to the enemies and their projectiles have huge hitboxes. It is going to take a lot of practice, memorization, and careful planning in order to clear stages in this one, and in order to avoid dying at every second, because due to the enormous hitboxes, often just being close enough to an enemy or even enemy bullets can kill you, meaning that you don't even have to touch the sprite to be killed. You're going to be killed by the transparent space around the sprite, because that's how big the hitboxes are. However, the same goes for the enemies. They can be trapped in the player's bubbles even when they so much as touch a single pixel of the bubble or the immediate area around the bubble. So it goes both ways. It's unfair for both the player and the enemies. The game's issues don't end there though, because, well, there's another big issue here, and that is the way enemies shoot projectiles and bullets. That has been a royal mess in this one, and let me explain why. If the enemy is supposed to shoot the player when the player is in the enemy's line of sight, the enemy will continuously keep firing their projectiles to a point where avoiding them becomes simply impossible, due to the player's movement and jump speed not being properly aligned and correctly balanced with the enemy projectile's firing speed. To clarify, the Bubble Bobble series has always had aggressive enemies that continuously shoot at the player and make things very difficult. However, the difference between the mainline and well-polished Bubble Bobble games and Super Bubble Bobble MD is the fact that MD has issues with hitboxes, with player movement speed compared to the enemy's shots, and so on. So we're looking at a balance issue first and foremost. Although having to entrap enemies in bubbles when they are not directly looking at the player is a great gameplay mechanic, and When done right, it can be very interesting. In fact, there are some enemies that become aggressive if you stand behind them. That's also a very interesting aspect of the game. It has all been implemented and executed rather poorly thanks to the enormous hitboxes and the poorly balanced firing rate enemies have. Now guys, these issues don't make Super Bubble Bobble unplayable by any means. They just make it much more difficult and much less accessible than a Bubble Bobble game should be, in my opinion. Now the game is not all bad. It has excellent controls, very good jump mechanics, and it borrows and mixes gameplay elements from other games in the series. For example, blowing bubbles in midair makes the player hover in place a little bit, which is very useful when it comes to fighting some of the bosses. The player can also fly around the screen or float in all 8 directions. First, they have to hold the fire button for a bit as the character inflates. This allows the player to start floating or flying around the screen very slowly. The flight mechanics in Super Bubble Bobble MD have been inspired by the flight or floating mechanics from Bubble Bobble Part 2 on the NES and Game Boy. However, whether because the developers wanted to make them more challenging or they just didn't know any better, I don't know, the movement in Super Bubble Bobble MD when the player is floating is very sluggish and slow, which adds to the game's overall increased level of challenge. The floating mechanics need to be used strategically in order to approach and defeat certain more dangerous enemies. Now this, guys, is not a mechanic that you can or want to exploit. This particular mechanic should only be used in certain situations when needed, as the player takes a long time to inflate, leaving them very vulnerable to enemy attacks and enemy movement. And once they start flying around, their movement is so slow that unless you really plan ahead, you are going to die to something. This isn't a mechanic that can be exploited, but it is one that can and should be used when the situation calls for it. The Bubble Bobble series would use bubbles with elemental power-ups in them as weapons against enemies and in boss fights. In Super Bubble Bobble MD, these type of powered-up bubbles are used in boss fights. This to me shows that the developers were familiar with the Bubble Bobble series enough to borrow and combine some of its more interesting elements. The first 2 bosses are pretty well made and fun to fight. However, as the game progresses, boss fights increase in difficulty and for all the wrong reasons. Now, the 3rd boss, for example, drops icicles on the player. That's a pretty decent mechanic. However, this one can be a royal pain to deal with, because there is no telegraph as to where the icicles will come from, and they fall so quickly that they become simply impossible to dodge. Now this, to me, screams poor game design, not challenging game design. Especially because the icicles come from the top of the screen, right? And due to the type of bubbles used in this particular boss fight, the player has to spend most of their time on the upper layers of the stage, meaning very close to where the dang icicles spawn from, in order to deal damage to the boss. So when the icicles spawn and immediately start falling down, there is simply no time to dodge them when you're already there near the top of the screen in order to be able to damage the boss. So this is just poor game design. Upon losing all lives, the player is treated to a continue screen, which is unique for each playable character. If there are no continues left, instead of a game over screen, the game kicks the player right back to the title screen. Now, after using a continue though, the player starts from the beginning of the level they lost all lives in, unlike in, say, Bubble Symphony, where a continue simply makes the player respawn while not resetting the progress of the level. As far as I can tell, there are only 4 lives at the player's disposal before they lose a continue, with no way to earn extra lives, which to me is a problem. You accumulate points, but there's nothing that gives you extra lives. So with the 3 or so continues, there are maybe 12 lives in total. This further adds to the game's already high difficulty level, which makes it not a very good Bubble Bobble game when they're supposed to be so accessible and user-friendly. It doesn't even have passwords like the NES original did. From what I can tell, guys, and I've played this game quite a lot, the game also lacks any power-ups, such as increased movement speed, increased firing rate, and so on that we have in the other Bubble Bobble games. And unlike Bubble Symphony, the stage progress is linear, meaning that the player doesn't get to choose which world they visit next after defeating a boss. The developers of Super Bubble Bobble MD did take inspiration from Bubble Symphony in one other aspect, and that is the crossover nature of the game. You see, in Bubble Symphony, the player visits different title worlds, such as Pocky and Rocky's world, New Zealand Story, Liquid Kids, Space Invaders, and Darius, and so on. This gives Bubble Symphony a very lovely and charming personality, making it a true love letter to Taito fans. And it really makes it a wonderful experience. The developers of Super Bubble Bobble MD took a page from the crossover book and decided to make two very popular at the time anime characters playable in the game, even though they didn't even have a license for any of this, right? The first one is Shin Chan, and the second one is Doraemon. When I first saw the game as a kid, or in my early teens, around 1996 or so, I didn't think much of this. I wouldn't learn about Shin Chan until 2 or 3 years more, when I accidentally played Shin Chan 4 on a multi-card for the Game Boy. Doraemon I was already familiar with because the Mega Drive game was sold here in bootleg form, and it was a fairly decent game. So to me, seeing Doraemon in a Sega Mega Drive game felt logical, normal, and not out of place at all. Same with Shin Chan, I just assumed he was just some kid who joined the rest of the gang on their Bubble Bobble adventure and didn't think much of it either. Other than their unique appearance, none of these characters have any special traits, unlike in Bubble Symphony, where the playable characters, all dragons mind you, have special attacks unique to each character. They're similar attacks, but they're still unique between the characters. In Super Bubble MD, they all just look different but play the same. It's very interesting to me that the developers, who we assume are GameTech or members of GameTech, seem to have been fairly familiar with both Shin-Chan and Doraemon, and given how popular these shows were in Asia, that wouldn't surprise me. This is pretty obvious in the characters' floating animations. Doraemon uses his hopter, or a bamboo copter that is on his head, to fly around the screen. Whereas Shin-Chan dons his Action Kamen costume, which transforms pretty much the entire sprite. Another huge difference between the mainline Bubble Bobble games and Super Bubble Bobble MD is the lack of any kind of timers in the stages. Now let me explain this a little bit more. In the official Bubble Bobble games, when the time runs out, an invincible enemy shows up chasing the player and following their every move, making it very difficult for the player to clear the stage at this point. This never happens in Super Bubble Bobble MD. Having an invincible enemy or some kind of a hazard appear when the player takes too long in a stage has been a staple in arcade games for years. From Evil Otto in Berserk to the wasps or bees or whatever they are in Mario Brothers and so on, we had these happen in most arcade games in order for players to not hog the cabinets, I guess. Another timed aspect of the main Bubble Bobble series is the limited amount of time enemies remain trapped in bubbles before freeing themselves. Again, in Super Bubble Bobble MD, this is not the case, as enemies stay trapped in bubbles and circulate around the stage indefinitely. Now guys, given the Super Bubble Bobble MD's overall structure, many hitbox and balance issues, I'd say this lack of timers is a good thing, because a slower and more methodical approach is absolutely necessary to clear stages of enemies in this game. Another trope often used in single-screen arcade games like this, that is also present in the official Bubble Bobble titles, is the last enemy standing becomes enraged in games like this, meaning that the last enemy that remains on screen becomes faster and more aggressive, making it more difficult to dispose of it or avoid it depending on what your goal is. Naturally, this is also not part of Super Bubble Bobble MD's design, so the player can take their time and clear enemies at their own leisure, which, believe me, is easier said than done given the game's numerous issues. Visually, Super Bubble Bobble MD is a decent-looking, competent Mega Drive game, though ultimately nothing all that special artistically. Some of the game's backgrounds are poorly compressed photos, while some are pixel art. An arcade variant also exists of this game, and it was released soon after the Mega Drive one, which runs on some kind of modified Mega Drive hardware, but with some differences. In the arcade version, the player is able to select which round they start on, and Doraemon and Shin Chan have been removed, so there are only 2 playable characters. Now, I couldn't find that version, so I have no footage to show you of that. Super Bubble Bobble MD is not a horrible game. It's not an unplayable game. It's just a game that needed a lot more work in order to be better balanced and better adjusted for players of all skill levels. So guys, if you are Bubble Bobble fans and haven't played this one, I urge you to give it a shot just to see what was done with the game. It's a very interesting and, in my opinion, surreal experience, as these bootleg games tend to be. However, you should expect a rather frustrating experience if you decide to play this seriously.